The thermometer outside the office window read -22 when I made the decision that we were on our own. Not -2, not -12. -22 degrees Fahrenheit, with a sustained wind out of the northwest at 31 miles per hour. Wind chill was somewhere around -55. The highway department had closed every road within 40 miles of us at 6 a.m., and the closure signs had been up for 2 days already. The last feed truck that made it to our yard had gotten in on a Wednesday. It was now Saturday morning, the second week of January, and we had 10,200 head of cattle in 16 pens, depending on us to figure something out. I want to tell you what 10,200 head of cattle represent, so you understand the weight of what I'm about to describe. Each animal in a feedlot at that stage of the feeding cycle consumes between 22 and 28 pounds of dry matter per day, a blend of corn, distiller's grains, hay, and mineral supplement. For our operation, which ran backgrounding calves at around 700 pounds average live weight, we were looking at approximately 126 tons of feed required every single day. At the point when the roads closed, we had 11 days of inventory in our commodity bins and hay storage. Not 30, 11. 11 days of feed, an unknown number of days until the roads reopened. And outside, a blizzard that the National Weather Service was calling the most significant winter storm to hit central Nebraska in 41 years. My name is Ray Stout. I've been running a cattle feeding operation outside of Ord, Nebraska, since 2001. My family has been in the cattle business in the Loup River country since my grandfather came back from Korea in 1953 and started a small cow-calf outfit with 17 head and a borrowed barn. What I was looking at on that January morning was the biggest operational challenge I'd faced in 23 years. And the first thing I did after looking at the thermometer was go find my feedlot manager, a man named Denny Carlisle, and tell him we needed to talk. Denny has been managing feedlots in Nebraska for 28 years. He's seen blizzards. He's seen cattle losses. He's seen the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from running a feeding operation in extreme conditions when the infrastructure you depend on isn't there. He sat across from me in the office, and I put the numbers on the table, and he looked at them without expression for about 30 seconds. Then he said, 11 days of feed, unknown closure duration. We're going to have to cut rations and find local sources. If you've ever been responsible for something alive that depends entirely on you, in conditions where your normal systems don't work, stay with me, because what we did over the next 30 days is something I had to rebuild from scratch every morning. And some of it worked and some of it almost didn't, and on day 28, we came closer to a real problem than I'm comfortable thinking about even now. Subscribe if you understand what it means to be the last line between an animal and a bad outcome. There are more of us in this business than people know. Day 1 of full isolation. We had 3 Cat 299 D3 skid steers and 2 John Deere 544L wheel loaders working around the clock to keep the feedlot roads open enough for our own equipment to move feed between the commodity buildings and the pens. The skid steers were running 12-hour shifts, operators rotating through, 2 men on and 2 off, because you can't run a skid steer in -22 wind chill for 12 continuous hours without losing someone to cold injury. The wheel loaders were clearing the main alleys. We were going through hydraulic fluid at 3 times our normal rate because cold thickens everything, and the machines were working under load, in temperatures they weren't designed to operate in continuously. The cattle themselves were doing what cattle do in extreme cold. Bunching. In a feedlot, bunching is a management problem because when 600 animals press together in a corner of a pen, the animals on the outside of the group lose access to feed and water. And if bunching goes on too long, the outside animals start to lose condition faster than the ones in the center. We broke up bunching 3 times a day using the skid steers. Not aggressive, just enough movement to distribute the animals back across the pen. It costs time and fuel, but it's non-negotiable. Water was the second crisis point. Our water system runs from a well to a distribution network that feeds heated waterers in each pen. The main line is buried 4 feet down, which under normal conditions is below frost line for this part of Nebraska. Under these conditions, with 4 days of -20+ temperatures and wind, we had surface ice building around the waterer bases that was blocking the heating element's ability to do their job. By day 2, 3 waterers in the south pens had partially frozen, and we were hauling water by tank truck from the main well to supplement those pens until we could get the elements freed up. Hauling water at -22 in a tank truck that wants to turn every exposed pipe into a sculpture is its own category of misery. The cold itself was doing something to the cattle I need to describe, because it's not obvious if you haven't managed livestock in extreme winter conditions. At -22 with a wind chill of -55, cattle burn calories just to maintain body temperature at a rate significantly higher than their normal metabolic baseline. A 700-pound animal that normally needs 22 pounds of dry matter per day might need 26 or 27 in those conditions just to stay even. So while our feed inventory was shrinking, our animals' caloric requirements were actually increasing. That's the double bind of winter feeding emergencies. The conditions that threaten your supply are the same ones that drive up your demand. I walk the pens twice a day, every day, looking at ear position, coat condition, and behavior. Ears pinned back, rough coat, animals standing apart from the group. Those are early signs of cold stress and declining condition. For the first 10 days, what I saw was animals that were managing. Cold, yes. Stressed, yes. But eating when feed was presented, drinking when water was available, doing what cattle do when they're not in trouble. That was the daily answer to the daily question. Day 4. Denny and I had a conversation about rations that I want to be straight with you about, because it's the part of this story I'm least comfortable telling, and probably the most important. When you're facing a fixed feed inventory and an unknown number of days of isolation, the mathematical answer is to reduce daily intake per animal. Not to zero. Cattle can't be starved, and cold weather actually increases energy requirements rather than decreasing them. But there is a range. Our target intake was 25 pounds dry matter per animal per day at the start. The floor we could responsibly go to, based on the body weight and condition of our cattle at that time, was about 20 pounds. That 5-pound reduction across 10,200 head saved us 51,000 pounds, about 25.5 tons, of feed per day, 25.5 tons per day. If we'd done that from day 1 of isolation instead of day 4, we'd have bought ourselves another 4 days of inventory. I made the decision on day 4. I wish I'd made it on day 1. That's one of the things I would tell anyone going into a situation like this. Make the hard resource decisions early, when you still have room to adjust, not when you're already feeling the pressure. The local sourcing problem started in earnest around day 6. I'd been making phone calls since day 2, working through every contact I had in a 60-mile radius, neighboring feedlots, commodity brokers, elevator managers, farmers who might have hay in a barn somewhere. The problem with a regional blizzard is that everyone within the affected area has their own problems. Most of my neighbors were in some version of the same situation. Corn supplies were locked in elevators that weren't moving. The distiller's grain plant in Fullerton had its own road access issues. What I found, on day 6, through a phone call that I made on a genuine hunch to a sugar beet processing facility near Scottsbluff, was a conversation that changed our situation in a meaningful way. The facility had a large inventory of wet beet pulp, a co-product of sugar beet processing that is an excellent cattle feed, high in digestible fiber, moderate energy, palatable. They had it because their normal purchasers couldn't get trucks to them any more than we could get trucks to us. They had 800 tons sitting in a pile they needed to move within 2 weeks before it deteriorated. They wanted to talk. Wet beet pulp is not a perfect substitute for our standard ration. The moisture content is high. around 75 to 80%, which means you need to feed significantly more of it by weight to deliver the same dry matter as corn or distiller's grain. But it is nutritious, it is palatable, and it can be blended into a ration to extend other ingredients. If we could get it to our yard, we could use it to offset roughly 30% of our daily dry matter needs. Getting it to our yard was the question. The main highways were still closed to commercial trucks. But Denny knew a man, a farmer named Gerald Pratt, who runs a seed business out of Burwell, who had a low-clearance farm road that connected to the county secondary road system in a way that bypassed the worst of the closures. Gerald had been using it himself to move equipment. The route was not ideal. It added about 40 miles to the trip from Scottsbluff and involved crossing a creek bottom on a bridge that I would not have wanted a loaded semi on in any weather, let alone this. Gerald said he'd drive it himself in his pickup first and call me back. He called back in 3 hours. He said, "The bridge will hold a tandem axle semi if you don't put anything over about 60,000 pounds on it. Beet pulp loads run about 48,000 on a tandem." He said, "I think it works." We moved 14 loads over the next 9 days, all coordinated through Gerald, all running that back road route. Each load took about 7 hours from the beet facility to our yard. We paid a premium on the pulp. The facility knew our situation, and we paid Gerald in cash for the road access, which he didn't ask for but I insisted on. The beet pulp bought us 11 days of reduced rate supplementation that we would not otherwise have had. By day 20, we had developed something close to a daily rhythm. The blizzard had broken on day 8, but the roads stayed closed through day 13 as the highway department worked through the snowpack. By day 15, we had limited commercial truck access restored. 1 lane, reduced speed, weather permitting, and the first full delivery of our standard commodity blend came in on day 17. But day 28 was where it nearly came apart. The beet pulp supply had run out on day 22. Our commodity bins were being replenished, but at a rate that was slower than our consumption because the trucks were still running on restricted access and partial loads. On the morning of day 28, I walked the feed inventory with Denny, and we had approximately 36 hours of reduced rate feed left in the yard. Not 11 days, 36. I called Denny first. He looked at the numbers the same way he'd looked at them on day 1, without expression, for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "We need a truck today, not tomorrow." Today. I said, "I know. There is a particular kind of phone call you make when something important depends on the person answering. You don't waste time on context they don't need. You state the situation in the clearest possible terms, and you let them make a decision with accurate information. I've made a lot of calls in my life, and I've gotten better at that kind of call over the years. The woman at Grand Island who answered, her name was Patricia, dispatch manager. I've worked with her for 11 years. I told her 36 hours. I told her our location. I told her we needed whatever was staged closest to us. She said, "I have a driver in Kearney who has been waiting 4 days for a road clearance window," she said. "I'll call you back in 20 minutes. She called back in 12. She said, "Willis says the window looks like it opens around 8 p.m. tonight. He'll drive it." I called our main commodity supplier, a company out of Grand Island. I told them the situation in plain terms. I said, "We have 36 hours. They had a truck that had been staged at a facility in Kearney, waiting for road conditions. The driver, a man named Willis, had been sitting in that truck for 4 days waiting for a clearance window. They told him he had a clearance window. He drove. Willis arrived at 11:40 p.m. on day 28. He had 48,000 pounds of corn and distiller's grain blend on his trailer. He backed into the commodity building while I stood there in the dark in -8 degrees and watched him unload. When the auger shut down and the building light was the only thing running, I stood there listening to the cattle in the pens. That low, collective sound a large group of animals makes at night. That particular hum that tells you they're okay. They were okay. The roads fully reopened on day 31. We had come through with our herd intact. No mortality events attributable to the feed shortage. No significant condition loss beyond what the cold itself had already caused. Denny ran the final weight data when we got back to normal operations, and our cattle were on average 4 days behind their projected feeding schedule. 4 days, on a 30-day blizzard isolation. There's a version of those 30 days that goes differently if I make different decisions. If I wait until day 10 to call the beat facility, Gerald can't scout the road before the second snowfall, and that route is gone. If I wait until day 12 to cut rations, I've already consumed the buffer those savings would have created. If I don't have Denny's 28 years of feedlot experience, I don't know what that version of the story looks like. And I'm glad I don't have to. What I do know is that when the roads opened on day 31 and the first full commercial delivery came through on a cleared highway, and our cattle were alive and healthy and 4 days behind schedule, that was not luck. That was the phone calls made early, ration decisions made before they were urgent, and relationships with neighbors like Gerald and drivers like Willis that exist because you've been a fair dealer for 23 years, and people remember it. I've been asked since then what the most important thing I did was. I always give the same answer. I made the phone call to the beat facility on day 6, not day 10, not day 14 when I would have been truly desperate. Day 6, when I still had room to negotiate, and Gerald still had time to drive the road before the second snowfall came through. Some emergencies give you a window. The window doesn't wait. Subscribe if you know what it feels like to be responsible for something that can't wait. Leave a comment. Tell me about the worst conditions you've ever worked cattle through. I read every one. See you in the field.